So, Jen, considering your deep experience in PMO and strategic planning, what key strategies should investment firms adopt to effectively navigate organizational change?
I think there are two that comes to mind. One thing is we take a step back and think about change management models that are widely used out there. There's ProSites, ACT-CAR, there's Cotter's 8-step, and all of that. That's all important, but I think the fundamental thing is to build overall project management into the change management or vice versa. So it's integrated, so it's a seamless process overall. I think of change management as a critical work stream and overall how the project is being executed and delivered. So I think that's the first thing to do is to integrate that overall. The second thing, and this is the hardest thing, but the most critical thing, is to build true ownership and accountability into the change. It's not just a sponsor on paper, but it's the person that truly owns the business results of the change, good or bad. And I think of it as, other than the CEO, do you have someone in your organization who can hold other leaders accountable? And that's exactly the role I played as a PMO leader. So it wasn't just a seat at the table, but was actually driving that accountability throughout the organization.
Great advice. So, how do you identify and mitigate common strategic planning pitfalls that could impact a firm's growth potential?
My favorite quote around this concept is strategy without execution is hallucination. That's a quote that's attributed to Thomas Edison. And what that means is that it's not just the big idea or the vision or the quantity of ideas, but actually how to turn that into a tactical plan that's delivered.
Mm-hmm.
And the key with strategic planning that many organizations don't do well is to actually vet the business case proposals cross-functionally and ensure that it's the best one that we're going forward with. Not just the good ones, not just it looks like it's a good idea. And I highlight the word best because it's not just something that is a good idea to do, but when you line it up with all of the other good ideas across the organization, it's the one that's truly best, ready to go, ready to execute because you have a plan in place and you do have the resources, and that will give you the best overall return. The second thing is think of it as if you're a CEO and you want funding for your organization, for your company that you're starting up, you have to put together a fairly well thought out, concise business case that is compelling. Why not do that at the organizational level with all of the project proposals that the leaders want to do? Have you put together a process to do that? It does not have to be an overly cumbersome process, but think about it as a Shark Tank pitch. Do you have your leaders come to the table with those business case proposals, have a concise pitch, and then make decisions cross-functionally? The other way to think about this is that the number one cause of projects failing, and keep in mind that the project failure rate is still something like 70%. And it's been that way for the last 50 or 60 years since it's been tracked and reported that the project failure rate is still 70%. Are you looking at the scarce capital dollars and also the human resources that are being invested and then making those intentional choices as to which of those good ideas will be able to give you the largest return? And the way I think about it, and I put together a very simple but compelling framework that I'm going to call strategize your portfolio. If you take a look at all the investments you're making in your organization, so it is projects and it's also to some extent operations, divided into 4 quadrants or 4 categories. On the x-axis, you can have low to high risk and then low to high value, and that will go on your y-axis. And then the quadrants are these, and these are broadly how you can allocate your organization's investment dollars internally into these 4 categories. The first category is keep the lights on or operations or maintenance. And ideally, that should be a minimal part of your investment. Maybe it's 10 or 20%. But initially, you will want to baseline and see where it lands for your organization because it might be as high as 40, 50, even 60%. The second category I'm going to call the product roadmap. These are ongoing enhancements to your existing products. You'll want to maintain those. Sometimes they're called bread and butter. The third category is what I call large platform. These are your digital transformations. These are your ERP investments. You do want to intentionally allocate for these. These are higher risk and lower value initially, but they actually are the foundation and the infrastructure for where you're going to go in your business for the next 3, 5, 10 years from now. So you'll want to intentionally invest in that as well. And then the fourth category is the true innovation, the R&D. These are truly things that have never been done before. As an example, when Netflix embarked on being essentially a content provider, a movie and TV studio, they had some investments in R&D for that while they were maintaining their shipping DVDs through the mail business, which was their bread and butter and their foundational business. So these four categories are things that you want to intentionally invest in and then allocate accordingly to your strategy. So what does that mean? If you are intentionally investing in a lot of R&D and your large platform, you're going to have to make room for that or reallocate from potentially your keep the lights on or your product roadmap. These are intentional decisions and not accidental. And I think that's actually one of the keys to mitigate the strategic planning pitfalls. It's not just having the idea. It's not even just having a good idea, but it's actually intentionally selecting the ideas that will go forward, be able to deliver and execute on. So it's not hallucination.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Jen. I appreciate it. The idea of concept, idea, and goals to moving that to strategy and then moving that to tactical project management and getting down to the brass tacks that properly support the strategy, I think is critical. That alignment between those three levels, right? And I liked how you mentioned, 70% of projects fail. And how much of that do you believe is due to not being realistic and honest about any given project, thereby creating project fallacy? As you alluded to, Jen, you mentioned the idea of communication being a key to success. What do you think about that? Is a lot of that failure is obviously you got poor strategy, maybe it's a bad idea to begin with, and then you also have just bad tactical approach to accomplishing that mission. But how much of that do you think is also just not being aligned in terms of the realities and just being honest about the endeavor that the organization is about to take on?
In my opinion, a large percentage of that is not being aligned internally and also not being realistic. Number one cause of failures for project is a lack of resources. So I spend some time up front to make sure it's correctly resourced. That's why I mentioned it's ready to go. It's ready to execute. Yeah. It's not so much a good idea, but someone has a plan with the corresponding resources. And keep in mind, when I mention resources, there's two types of resources. There's the human resources, absolutely. There's also the financial resources or your budget. And then with human resources, there's capacity. So do you have the sheer number of people in your organization? But then there's also capability or skill sets. And we've evolved in terms of being a primarily operational, I think. Maybe if you look back 20 years ago, maybe in an organization, it was 80% operations and potentially 20% project. To nowadays, I believe it's 80% projects and 20% operations. Why is that? Well, I think there's certain trends that's happening in the future of work, which is actually happening now. And those are things like skill-based roles, where in the past, maybe we had a certain job title, whether it's project manager or change manager or something else. And we had a list of things that we did. Maybe it was daily, maybe it was weekly, monthly, and we just executed on that. Nowadays, with the advent of, it's not just AI, but yes, AI and all of the digital transformation initiatives, things are rapidly changing. And we do have to have not only the technical skills, the project management skills, but also the business domain knowledge in order to effectively execute. So that's where I mean by it's not only capacity, it's also the capability. And the skills are rapidly changing. It's estimated something like 65% of the job skills will change by the year 2030. That's only 6 years from now. So imagine that.
So Jen, speaking of business domain knowledge, and in your previous response, you'd mentioned the idea of the CEO and investment alignment and strategy. This is more of a general question, but can you discuss the impact of effective change management on the growth and valuation of investment-centric organizations?
Yes, I think of change management as really the enabler of how we implement change. And all change is implemented through projects. So it's really about if 70% of your initiatives are failing, that's actually money down the drain. So, in terms of valuation and growth, isn't it in your best interest to actually do what it takes up front to make sure that the needle is moved on that 70%? And I would challenge people to measure where they're at today with their project success rates. So that 70% is very broad, and obviously it's a statistic out there and it's been touted for decades. But what is it in your organization in terms of the project success rate? And really focus on the most critical ones, the ones that are truly transformational, that's going to give you the growth, that's going to grow your revenue, or make your company more efficient. Focus on that, measure it, and then think about what does it take to move the needle on it. I would propose that it's number one, resources. It's always resources. And so do the planning up front. And I have a very simple resource planning technique that I use to just vet out those business case proposals. Because again, it's not just, is it a good idea? It's about, can it be executed? And do we have the capacity and capability to execute that? The second
Yeah.
thing about change is that we have to remember change starts with all of us. So it's one thing to follow all of the change management models, and I see those being executed. It's almost like a fill out the template, check the box. Let's
Yeah.
ensure the messaging is out there. Let's ensure that we have training and support. All of that is super critical and important. But at the end of the day, I think it's about if we want to do transformation and we want to make sure our change is successful, and our change is being adopted effectively, how can we improve the process? Not just do a lift and shift, but actually improve the process, make it better. So if it's an internal project to end users, is it a better experience for them overall once we implement the change? If it's an external project to end customers, is it something that we actually have improved in terms of that customer experience? That actually, to me, is effective change management. And then ultimately, that drives the growth and valuation going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Good insight. So, Jen, Nestell Associates supports a great deal of mergers and acquisitions. And in your approach to PMO setup and strategic planning, what unique considerations come into play for firms with a strong focus on growth through acquisition and expansion specifically?
Well, I think the first thing is to think about, are you balancing your operational work and intentionally allocating to that versus all of the project work? So, the project work in those three categories that I mentioned, which includes the innovation, your product roadmap, and your large platform migrations or implementations. And the reason I say this is that what I see is that the work and the teams that are necessary to do the operational work is fundamentally different than the transformational work. And if you don't intentionally allocate and build your A team for the transformational work, that's where I think a lot of those initiatives do fail, because we're taking operational people who are great and they're absolutely needed to maintain the current operations, to maintain the current projects, versus the people that are needed to do transformation are the A team. And you need to intentionally build your A team, set aside those dedicated resources, and then empower them to execute through an organization like a PMO. And I say like a PMO, whether you call it a PMO or not, and it really depends on the organization. Do you have someone that is full-time, dedicated, focused, and I emphasize full-time and dedicated, to ensuring that projects are being executed on time, on budget, on scope, but then most importantly, delivers the value that it was intended? And I think that's actually the biggest pitfall when we have large mergers and acquisitions that happen, is that we think just by designating an operational person. So it can be an operational leader. Let's just say the CIO or the CFO or the chief product officer. There's a number of those people that can be designated, but their role is not a full-time dedicated role to ensuring that these transformational initiatives are being executed.